Hey guys, welcome to episode number 2 of Simply Lighting. Today we're going to be diving into the subject of motivated light. I remember when I first started gripping, the first year and a half I was working in the lighting department. And I remember watching the gaffer and they'd walk into a room and trying to kind of get inside their brain and think about how are they going to light the scene? What's their approach going to be? And I knew all the gear. I knew the workflow of the lighting department, and I understood what was happening once the lights were set up. But I had no idea when we walked into this completely fresh and new environment, how are you going to light this scene? And I think that this is a common frustration for a lot of folks because whenever we're lighting, we can light one scenario really well and knock it out of the park, but the next day that we shoot at a different location, it's going to be a completely different set of variables. It's a completely different lighting scenario. And so this sort of idea of motivated lighting, and it kind of created a cheat sheet, if you will, to determine how you light for different locations. So whenever I walk into a room for the first time, there's 4 key attributes that I'm going to be looking for that are going to help me determine what kind of lighting would be believable in this scenario. So the first thing I'm going to be looking at is color temperature of the different sources in the location. So for example, do we have windows? That's going to be a daylight balanced source. Or do we have maybe incandescent lamps? So just like normal household lamps, those are going to be on the tungsten side. And sometimes you'll also, maybe like in a bar scenario, you'll have more neon lights, which would be red or blue or green, different colors like that. So taking note of the different color temperatures and color hues that you find in your location. So after we've determined the color temperature, the next thing we're going to look at is light direction. So there's 3 main light directions that we're going to look at today. Number 1 is going to be top lit. A good example of this is going to be if you're in an office scenario and you've got fluorescent overheads that are lighting the location. That would be an example of top lit. The next one is side lit or eye line. This is window light, is usually going to be near our eye level. You've also got lamps. Both of those are examples of things that are at eye level or going to be side lighting your talent. The final direction is probably the most unusual and least common, but it's underlit. A good example of this is if you have a lantern that a character is holding or a flashlight. Again, not very common. It's rare, but it's good to note. The third thing I'm going to look at is quality of light. Now, this isn't as straightforward. It's a little bit more nuanced, but it's very important. Looking at the size of the source is going to determine how soft it is. So if you have a big window source, that's going to be pretty soft. If you have a really small bare bulb that's incandescent, that's going to be really harsh. So I take note of what are the softness levels of the light sources in the room. The final thing that I'm going to look at that's not as important, but if you want to get more specific with your lighting, is going to be looking at the ratios in the room. Basically, how deep are the shadows compared to the highlights? What's the contrast in the room? Are the shadows really deep and the highlights really bright? Or is just kind of everything sort of bright or everything sort of dark? And I don't want to dive too deeply into this because it can be a real nitty-gritty discussion and can be honestly more confusing than helpful. But it's something to note that we want to look at what's kind of the general contrast or ratios that we're seeing in the room. So to review here, we've talked about identifying what's the color temperature of the sources in the room, the direction of light, the quality of light, and the ratios that we're seeing. Now, what this list is going to help you with, and eventually it's just going to become internalized and you're not going to have to think through a list, but I know for me, lists and structure are really helpful. But what this does is it's basically going to help you get a feel for what is the light doing in the room. And once you're about to set up your lighting sources, you're going to know, I want to emulate what's already happening. You're not going to do the same thing, obviously, otherwise you wouldn't be lighting, but you're going to light in a way that's going to reflect the lighting that's already happening, either in the room or sort of in your story room, in the room that you want the world to look like in your scenario. So I'm going to hop in here to a project that I lit and kind of share how these three motivating factors apply to this project and two others that I've worked on. All right, so we're here in a chiropractic office. That was the location that we were shooting in. And so typically offices, medical facilities are going to have white light coming from the ceiling. So stuff's going to look top lit and it's going to be daylight balanced. So we've got those two things covered. Quality of light, it's usually not super soft, but I wouldn't say usually very hard either. So kind of in the middle in office settings. And typically the ratios in these scenarios are going to be pretty high key. So basically what that means is everything's going to be pretty bright. There's not going to be a lot of contrast, but because this short film that we were shooting here was it was a drama. It was very intense and dramatic. We wanted to really bump up that contrast. So we kind of bent the rules there, which is a good example of when you're approaching a location, you're not always going to follow the rules. You're going to adjust them to best promote your story, especially when it comes to quality of light and ratios. So for the lighting in this scene, we wanted it to be top lit and daylight. So we took an LED Fresnel and we shot it up into the ceiling just to make it a little bit softer and to have it coming from the top so that it would make sense. And then that really played nicely on our talent here. As you can see, it's coming from the top and it's pretty soft. It feels pretty sourceless, which is nice and fits into that scenario. It feels like a clinic. So we have that playing. We have just a little eye light in her eye, which we'll talk about later, but that's not really affecting the lighting on her face too much. It's just to add a little sparkle to her eye. And the final thing we have here is this sort of quasar-like tube. It's not a quasar, but similar idea. And basically the motivating factor for that is just the location. If you're in a doctor's office, a lot of times they're going to have LED lights to sort of put closely to people, maybe their arm or their leg, if they want to look closely and see if there's an injury or what have you. So this felt like it played well in that world. So this is a very simple example of how the motivated light is used, but it's kind of goes to show how we use this framework applied to this lighting scenario. So this next frame is also from the short film Wheelchair. So looking at this scene in light of our four attributes, we had kind of wanted our source to come from this window on the left-hand side here. And we wanted it to kind of feel sort of like golden hour, more or less, and just kind of warm tones. So for color temperature, we wanted it to be daylight, but just a little hint of warmth in there, kind of like golden hour. Direction, we wanted it to be coming from the side because it's coming out of the window, so side lit. For quality, we wanted it to be pretty soft, quite soft, because windows are typically soft, and we wanted it to be a very happy and appealing scenario. And in terms of ratio, we wanted it to more or less remain the same as in the doctor's clinic, just because it's the same project and we didn't want it to feel very different. So looking at our lighting sources, we've got three lights going on in this scene. Number one, we have our key, which is an LED going through some silk. So it's pretty basic here. And that's what's keying our talent, both of the mother and the child. And then we've got our second source, which is an HMI coming from outside. And that is what's causing this streak on the background. And we had a flag kind of cutting off the top of that to give it some shape. But that was also motivated by the outside light and kind of this idea of direct light. So we've got sort of the soft ambient light that's lighting our talent. And then we've got this fun harsh light playing on the background. And then the final last little touch, you can barely see it, but there's these kind of streaks here in the other room, and that's as if there was a window in that room back there as well. We just wanted to add a little extra to the scene. So this is another pretty basic example, but it gives you a feel of how these principles play out in an actual scenario, actual film. All right, so with this next frame, we've saved the most complicated for last, but all the rules still apply, all the principles still work in this context. So we've got a scene with our talent here in an alleyway. So if we look at kind of our motivating factors, whenever we're in a street, outside, in the city at night, you're going to notice with color temperature that you've got lots of varying color temperature, which is really crazy. It's kind of like the Wild West of color temperature. You've got varying colors of orange, and then you've got some daylight and some really wacky green and crazy stuff happening in the color temperature world. So what we do know is there's just loads of different color temperatures. In terms of direction, most of it's going to feel top lit, but there's also side lit going on. So it's, again, a little bit of a Wild West, but as a whole, it's coming from the top. The third thing being quality of light, it's going to be harsh. The vast majority of light, it's going to be small sources that are far away. It's going to be harsh light. And then in terms of ratios, it's going to be pretty contrasty because it's just black, and then you've got your bright sources. So here's how we lit the scene with that in mind. We had a quasar crossfade that was, as a practical, you can't see it, but it's to the left of camera. And that was keying our talent from this left side here. And you can see that's a small source. It's really harsh and it's not super flattering, but we're not going for flattering in this context. We want it to look nice and feel alive, but we don't want it to feel like it's really pretty when we're in a street. And so the next light that we have is a big 8x8 bounce with a 2K open face shooting into that. And you don't necessarily need it for this shot per se, but it's kind of for the sake of the whole scene. And that's kind of filling in this side of her face, as you can see, and kind of adding information on her shoulder there. But really was a strategy for the scene as a whole. But that still fits into our picture. It's a different color temperature. You can see our key is warmer than that. So we dialed that quasar in to be just a little bit more grungy feeling. So it played into this feeling of, oh, we're outside, we're in the street. So our next light that we had was an Aputure 300D sort of knockoff light. There was this bridge up here going between two buildings across the alleyway. So we put our light up there, and that's coming in, and it's a really harsh light, and it's edging our talent there. And this is daylight. So we're playing that in, I wouldn't say we're playing this as moonlight because you don't see it working in the background here, but we're playing into the variety of color temperatures that are happening in this Wild West of, we've got this really grungy and warm light here, and we've got this more clean tungsten look here, and then we've got blue coming in. And then the final light that we've got is just a little additive thing that we did to keep it from being all black back here, is we added a 1K on the bridge back here, and that was just shooting straight down and hitting the street down here to lift the levels just a little bit so that it didn't feel like it was complete darkness. So you can see how we're kind of following the rules of, we're top lighting mostly. We're doing a little bit of side lit just to make it look a little bit nicer. But mostly it feels top lit. It feels grungy. You've got the variety of color temperatures. It's harsh. We're not going with super, super soft sources for the most part. The 8x8 is a little bit softer, but that was a more of a creative choice. So we decided to go from that intentionally. So if we look at this from as a whole, this is a very complicated lighting setup. However, each of these lights is motivated by the scenario. We're going to get into future videos how you decide what looks good for your project and what looks good for your scene. But all of this makes sense. None of this would surprise me because I know, oh, we're lighting something at night. We want it to look grungy. We want the color temperatures to vary. We want it to mostly come from above. That would feel natural. And it's going to feel a little bit darker and it's going to be harsher. So that's a quick look at these 3 different lighting setups and how we can kind of look at that through the lens of these attributes, these 4 lighting attributes. Now, I don't expect you guys to walk away from this video feeling confident to light any scenario. That's not my goal. My goal is basically to give you sort of a bird's eye view of this is a strategic way to light any scenario, so that as we learn more tactics along the way in this series, you'll be able to place those tactics within the larger strategy. The last thing that I want to do is teach you how to light a very specific scenario well, and you're able to do that, but you don't feel like you can light this plethora of different scenarios that you're going to run into with every location and all these different variables. I want to give you the bird's eye view of how we approach lighting, and then in future videos, we'll move into tactics. All right, guys, so that's going to wrap up this episode. Thanks so much for joining, and we will see you in the next one.